Welcome to the Biochar Show, where the spark of innovation meets the promise of sustainability. I'm your host, Megan K. Lees, and today we're diving into the future of biochar with Myles Gray, Executive Director of the United States Biochar Initiative. Since stepping into leadership in 2024, Myles has been at the forefront of expanding biochar's impact, driving market growth, setting industry standards, and advocating for its transformative potential in environmental sustainability. I'm thrilled to have him on the show and share his journey, insights, and the exciting possibilities ahead. Welcome, Myles.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for being here. How is your day going?
It's going great. Spring is in the air here in Portland. Flowers are out, so that's always positive. And we have the sunny half of the year is ahead of us, so it's great.
I feel you. Same on my end. Well, thanks for taking time out and coming to chat with myself and my listeners. So everyone always has a story about how they discovered biochar. I was just curious, what was yours? Was there a defining moment when you thought, this is what I want to focus on?
It was actually probably a few points where it all happened. Back in 2007, I was visiting West Virginia, and it was a sort of mentor of my wife's at the time. And he was head of an organization called the International Rural Water Association. This guy named Fred Stottlemyre, a really great guy. And he had been using biochar in Honduras to treat drinking water, like locally produced biochar in Honduras. And he was really super into it. And that was sort of the initial seed. And then over the next couple of years, that sort of germinated in my mind. And I had always wanted to go back to grad school at that time. And so in 2010, I kind of made the leap and moved from the East Coast to the West Coast out to Oregon to study biochar at Oregon State University under a man named Marcus Glaber, a very sort of soil organic carbon scientist who was doing a lot of work on biochar at the time. So that was the initial spark. And then honestly, when I got out of grad school, there really wasn't a biochar industry to speak of at that time in 2013. So I went into engineering, into civil engineering, and did a lot of work in water resources. And then I think my second sort of entrance into the biochar space was in, I think it was 2021. A man named Thor Kallestad of Minel Carbon just gave me a call out of the blue one day and wanted to talk about biochar and stormwater management, which is something that I've been doing a lot in my civil engineering job. So that was kind of the second great awakening in my biochar life, was just the idea that, hey, now there actually is an industry that you can go work full time in. So sort of like that initial piece, and then there wasn't really much to speak of, but then sort of hopping back in 2021.
That's awesome. So as an executive director of USBI, what are your top priorities this year? Now that because you have 2024, it's pretty new.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been at USBI almost 2 years now, and really with a mandate to just sort of change and increase our impact and reach. And just at a high level, our organization is just focused, generally speaking, on increasing the production and use of biochar. And we do that mostly by trying to support the sort of private industry, but also potentially municipal facilities to produce more biochar. And our primary focus is on developing markets. So particularly for physical biochar. So getting in front of different other industries that might use biochar as ingredients in their processes in agriculture and construction, in water treatment. And I'll dig into those a little bit more as we move forward in this podcast. But beyond that sort of market development effort, there's a few other things that we're working on a lot this year. First is developing and finishing off our work on creating an American national standard for biochar. So that's something that I've been spending a lot of my time on the last 16 months or so. And really critical need for the industry is to develop better standards for biochar that work in North America. So that's one. Another is we're launching an effort to create better coordination within the biochar industry itself. There's a real lack of, I think, communication and collaboration across the industry. So we're working on launching an industry roundtable. And that'll be primarily focused on kind of the industrial producers in the industry, but also carbon credit companies and other players in the carbon ecosystem, financiers, biochar products companies, and equipment manufacturers. So it's really an effort to kind of better coordinate the industry. And then the final big effort, which is always an effort of ours, is our annual conference. So our annual conference, we hope this will be the biggest yet, maybe the biggest biochar event yet held in the world. We're hoping to get to 1,000 participants, and that'll be in Minneapolis this September 15th to 18th. So we're really excited about that as well.
And is that just US based, or is that worldwide?
It's the North American Biochar Conference. So it tends to be a little more focused on the US and Canada, though we have participants from all over the world.
Oh, wow, that's amazing. 1,000 people, impressive. So expanding end use markets is a major factor for biochar. What applications are gaining the most traction and what sort of roadblocks still need to be addressed?
Yeah. There clearly is a lot of growth in using biochar. We at USBI, we tend to focus on five end use markets, and I'll just list them, and I'll describe a little bit about what we do in each of them. First off is biochar as a soil amendment. So that's clearly an important one. Also using biochar as in fertilizer products to create enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and then horticulture and potting media, and then stormwater and environmental remediation. And then the final one we work on is using biochar as an additive in concrete. So starting off at a soil amendment, that's clearly been one of the major uses of biochar to date. It's where a lot of the interest for a lot of different people kind of gets you started in that soil amendment space. Our focus in that area is really to try and, at least in the United States, scale up the deployment of conservation funds from NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is an agency of USDA, the Department of Agriculture. And so our goal there really is to help increase awareness of biochar within the agencies and within that set of professionals that helps coordinate those payments to farmers. So what we're finding is that a lot of folks inside of NRCS, when a farmer goes and asks about biochar, it can be pretty hard for them to use biochar because the agency staff themselves aren't necessarily the most knowledgeable. So what we're doing, we're kicking that off this fall, is a train the trainer program where we're going to be doing probably something like 10 of these in the next few years around the country to really train up NRCS staff and conservation district staff so that when a farmer wants to use biochar, they find somebody across the table from them that understands what they're trying to do and can help get them into the process, and not just get them into the process, but make sure that they're going to use the right type of biochar and do it the most effectively they can possibly do it. Because what we really want out of this type of program is wins. We want farmers to see the benefits of biochar and to really improve their processes. So that's the soil amendment space. Next in biochar enhanced fertilizers. So this is the idea that you can add a small amount of powdered biochar primarily to nitrogen fertilizer to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of fertilizer. And the value proposition in this space really is the idea that a farmer can use less nitrogen because nitrogen is expensive. And so in this space, we're doing a lot of R&D projects. We have a project right now in Washington State, and we've been working with a private company called Vernovo Sustainable Products. They're based in Tennessee, and they've been doing some really great work in developing these in collaboration with USBI. One of the really cool products we're excited about is biochar coated urea pellets. So it's sort of a standard urea nitrogen fertilizer with a biochar coating as a slow release fertilizer. And that's that. And then horticulture and potting media. This is a real, I think, significant near-term opportunity for the industry, and one where I could really see a lot of growth in the short term. Potting media companies like Scott's, like Oldcastle, and a lot of the sort of local companies, they're all aware of biochar, and a lot of them have used it. And it's primarily being used as a partial replacement for peat. And peat is a really incredible material, but it is expensive. It has supply chain logistics issues that make it increasingly expensive and hard to source. And it also, is a pretty environmentally destructive product. It's created by draining wetlands, and most of those are in northern Canada. And so in terms of its environmental footprint, a lot of different companies have been trying to move away from pricing and environmental impact issues. And biochar is a really great substitute there. So we think there's a lot of potential in that space, and it's a pretty significant market that has the ability to pay some attractive rates and prices for biochar producers. Then in stormwater and sort of environmental remediation, this is sort of a space near and dear to my heart. I spent 8 years or so in this industry, actually 10 if you include my very early career, really using biochar as a way to remove pollutants from water and soil. And one of the things we're doing in this space is pairing up with a national nonprofit, the Center for Watershed Protection, to develop out a guidance manual for using biochar in stormwater management. And having been in that industry for so long, a lot of how guidance is developed in that industry really, different professionals need to be able to have a manual or some sort of guidance that they can draw from to be able to show it to their client or their boss or anybody else. They need to be able to point to something authoritative, right? To say, hey, look, Center for Watershed Protection and USBI, this is their guide for how to use biochar. So that's something we're working on a lot too, is how we do that sort of manual. And then the final one is concrete. So biochar in concrete is a growing use. One of the challenges in that space are specifications. So we're going to be working on a project, and this is being led by Lori Tunstall at the Colorado School of Mines. We'll be supporting Lori primarily on an effort to develop an ASTM standard, which is another sort of standards process, to develop an ASTM standard for using biochar as an additive in concrete. So that's sort of the five that we pay attention to most. There's a lot of other markets, but when we think about prioritizing, we're thinking about a few things. One, we're thinking about market size. So market size is important for USBI, particularly because of how it relates to climate. I'll give you an example. There's some other markets, things like graphene. Like I think there's definitely a market there, but it's a pretty high-tech space, and the total volume of biochar that's likely to go into that overall is not going to be enormous. It's going to be very important for a smaller set of companies, but we're really focused on those technologies and those end-use markets that might have a climate-relevant impact, I guess.
And do you feel like with farmers and such, I know just with the other people that I've sort of been recording, like on the East Coast, they sort of use biochar solely on the farms on that end, and vice versa. Do you think like on the West Coast, you kind of, I guess with biochar, do you keep it on the West Coast for farmers to benefit, or is it is it a North American US like product that can be spread anywhere?
I think there is going to be some shipping of material. And in terms of like applicability to farms, well, first up, I think a lot of different types of farms can benefit from biochar. But we do you see in the literature, if you look at the literature closely, it's pretty clear that the biggest benefits of biochar tend to be in low quality soils. And also, you're clearly going to get the biggest benefit in higher value cropping systems. And that's for a few reasons. First off, there's more revenue on a higher value cropping system, right? So if you get a yield improvement, it means a lot more if you're growing apples than if you're growing soybeans. It's also true that a lot of specialty crops haven't had the same level of research applied to them as like corn and soybeans in Iowa. And much as I would love to see biochar used in corn and soybeans in Iowa, it's sort of a hard sell because first off, Iowa fields and soil is like naturally some of the best in the world. And also, the cropping systems are so dialed in Iowa or in Illinois or in any of those kind of the Corn Belt areas. The cropping systems are extremely dialed in, very high quality, very dialed in. So in a lot of ways, the low-hanging fruit really is focusing on specialty crops. And when you really consider where those are in the U.S., particularly where specialty crops overlap with sandy soil, they tend to be places like the West Coast, like Florida, like the Southeast U.S., and also in places like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin. There's a lot of opportunities out there where sandier soils overlap with higher value crops. And those are kind of like some of the really high value targets, in my opinion.
What policy changes or regulation shifts would accelerate biochar adoption in the US? Like, are there any legislative efforts or industry standards in development at the moment?
Yeah, there are. Before I jump into any, I just want to point out USBI, we're not primarily a policy-focused organization. We do some work on policy, but we actually mostly partner with an organization called the United States Biochar Coalition for anything related to sort of policy work. So they're a really great organization, and they focus really on that lobbying piece at the state level, but mostly at the national level. But I will say there are some key pieces there. One is something called 45Q. And so 45Q I think it was established maybe under George W. Bush, but it was broadened under the Inflation Reduction Act to include carbon removal. But when that was done, it used some language that was mostly focused on direct air capture and carbon capture and storage via geologic storage. What we would love to see for the biochar industry is really making that tax credit technology agnostic. And in reality, when you look at the use of that tax credit, it hasn't been nearly as high as expected because DAC is still so expensive, direct air capture, that it hasn't really been utilized. We would love to see that tax credit be broadened so that it can be used for by biochar producers. So that's one. I think the next one is just making sure that funds are still available for farmers to use biochar. I think it's an enormous opportunity. And, a lot of farmers want to use biochar, but there isn't enough information out there right now for them to know how to do it. So we're just hoping that those programs continue to roll out and include biochar production or use of biochar by farmers. And also, we would love to see some streamlining of how those programs work. My wife worked for NRCS for 11 years, and it's not always the most efficient and sort of straightforward process for a farmer to go get reimbursed for using biochar.
And are you hoping farmers create their own biochar on the actual farms, or instead of having to actually like outsource it?
I think that's a possibility. In the US, I think it's kind of hard to make that work. There are a few exceptions to that, but for the most part, we're hoping to make sure that farmers can purchase biochar and apply it. There's a few on-farm production technologies, particularly air curtain incinerators, and also a company called Applied Carbon that's doing some really cool work. Essentially, it's a biochar production system that gets pulled behind a tractor and actually makes biochar while it moves around your field, and then sort of shoots biochar back out behind it as it drives. So that's a really cool technology.
It's amazing.
So,
Yeah.
and then the final piece of kind of policy that's really important that often gets overlooked, I think, including honestly by myself, is air quality regulations and how biochar is treated under air quality regulations. And it historically, has been looked at as incineration, but it's not incineration, it's pyrolysis or gasification. So it's a different process. And, just one example of how biochar, I think, should be treated differently. Right now, I'm in Oregon, and so there's a lot of forestry in Oregon, and part of that process is burning slash. So when you go log, you produce a whole lot of limbs and branches that get left on site that have no real marketable value. So you get these enormous piles, 30, 40 feet tall, and there are these systems called air curtain incinerators, and they're sort of a cleaner way to burn those piles, and they actually produce biochar in the process. When you burn one of these giant piles, you create a significant amount of air pollution. Burning a big wet pile, and they tend to burn them in the winter here when it rains because that reduces sort of wildfire risk. Right, so they're burning these giant piles, but they're wet, and they create a lot of air pollution, particularly air emissions mostly. These air curtain incinerator units generate far less air pollution, something like 95% reduction in particulate emissions. But right now, if you want to go burn that slash pile in a big bonfire, you just have to file a pretty simple piece of paper that gets filed online. I think it's a $35 permit fee to go do that. If you want to go burn it more cleanly with an air curtain incinerator, you have to go get an air quality permit, like a more complicated air quality permit. And honestly, it should be the other way around, right? We should be incentivizing and simplifying the process for using air quality and air curtain incinerators, as opposed to making it very easy to go torch these things in bonfires.
One more complicated thing.
Yeah.
So you've worked with major projects like the USBI and IBI Global Biochar Market Survey and the North American Biochar Conference. Any standout findings or takeaways from either of those?
Yeah, that was a really great project. And, we hope to do that again. We got something like, I think, 1,000 respondents from over 100 countries. So we were really happy with the turnout there. Something like 400 or 500, I think it was 500 from North America and just over 400 from the US. So, we did get a little overemphasis on the US and North America, but that was mostly because USBI was one of the project partners. So we pushed it a lot to get people in North America responding to that survey. I was actually kind of surprised by two things. First off, how clear it was that end use markets for biochar were rated extremely highly. And that honestly was something I had found before working at USBI. I worked for a company called Myles Gray. And that, to me, when I was at Myles Gray, that was so clear to me that developing end-use markets for biochar to be able to generate offtake agreements for biochar was so critical to getting these facilities financed. It was just so clear to me when I was at Myles. So to see that echoed in this survey was really powerful for me, and it really confirmed the fact that moving forward, that really led me to believe and to implement that moving forward, USBI's mission really is to focus on those end-use markets. So that was a really great thing to see. And I was actually really surprised that so many people in that survey also identified standards as being a key need. Standards are not flashy, they're not all that exciting, but they are so important to building a real industry. So I was actually kind of surprised to see that many people really believe that standards are extremely important.
What are the biggest misconceptions or barriers preventing wider biochar adoption? Like, can the industry overcome them? Is there What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, at a base level, one of the biggest misconceptions is what is biochar and what is the biochar production process. It's not a simple answer. And honestly, it's a challenge even for me. So I often start by saying, well, biochar is a physical product, but it's also a process. That can be pretty confusing. So yes, it is a physical product. It's essentially the same as charcoal, but if you burn it for heat like charcoal, it's no longer biochar, it's charcoal or it's biocarbon, right? So I think some of the definitions, honestly, are hard for the industry. So I think that's just at a basic level. I also think among folks like farmers, there's just an inherent degree of skepticism, I think, among the farming community. And I think that's healthy. And part of that is that farmers are typically and regularly pitched with the next latest and greatest technology, right? Trust me, this product is going to triple your yield or double your yield. And I think sometimes in the biochar space, there's a little bit of magical thinking where it's sort of a just add biochar, just sprinkle biochar on there and everything will flourish. And at the end of the day, like biochar is not magic. It's very effective at different things, but it's not magic. And so I think it's on the biochar industry to really better understand what it is about biochar that makes it effective in different end uses and then try and improve those benefits and products so that biochar can be used effectively to solve other industries' problems. I think there's a tendency in the biochar space to believe so much in the solution that it becomes sort of self-fulfilling, but other users of biochar, they're not interested in biochar. They're interested in some other problem entirely. So I think it's really an important thing to make sure we're focusing on the needs of end users and others in the space and not just the biochar concept.
Well, same thing, like you were saying, adding fertilizer to it as well changes that as in another aspect.
Yeah.
So more companies I feel like are investing in biochar and as this emerging market. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs and businesses looking to get involved or spread the word at least?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I can tell very clearly is the biochar industry is thriving. But one of the things I also try and focus on is really trying to identify what are the revenue streams that are going to work for your particular project. If you're focused on production, a biochar project can essentially create revenue via four revenue streams. First off are the carbon removal credits. Then there's physical biochar. Then there's heat or other products you can produce from pyrolysis gases, even things like fuels. And then the final one, which can be a cost but can also be a revenue source, are tipping fees. So waste management tipping fees. So you can in some cases get paid to take waste. Right now, the carbon credit revenue is essentially the easy part. Um, the physical biochar is a challenge. So there's an enormous opportunity right there. And in the biochar industry right now, there's an enormous opportunity to actually focus more on becoming a product manufacturer than a biochar producer. There's more physical biochar available in the market today than there is demand for it. And so that presents an enormous opportunity to really focus on products. And we're starting to see that with a handful of different companies really focusing on building out products. You see that in the concrete space with companies like Solid Carbon, in the fertilizer space with companies like Renovo, in the potting media space with companies like Rosy Soil. So we're really starting to see some evolution there. And then the final piece is really, I mentioned tipping fees. That's an enormous opportunity, and really reducing your feedstock cost is one of the best things you can do. Identifying locations where you can either have very low feedstock costs or get paid to take waste. And some of those examples are things like wastewater treatment plants, right? There's a growing market to produce biochar at wastewater treatment plants from biosolids. Construction and demolition debris recycling facilities. So that's a common thing. Like when you tear down a house, there's construction and demolition debris recycling. Even at landfills, we're seeing some facilities putting in sorting technology to sort the sort of plastic and other garbage from the biomass waste and then turn that into biochar. And then another really interesting example that I'm seeing pop up more and more is using, going back to these air curtain incinerators, these mobile units to go process waste from natural disasters. So a great example is the Southeast US. Almost every year there's a hurricane that hits the Southeast US, and those destroy or knock down millions of trees. And a lot of communities really don't know what to do with them because they don't just want to have enormous bonfires that degrade air quality. So there's actually a pretty significant opportunity to have these sort of mobile units and move around to disaster areas and then go process a huge amount of that sort of downed feedstock. So really just bringing it all back together, I think really focusing on maybe more specialized business models is one of the best things that biochar producers or product manufacturers can do right now, is really focusing on those areas where you can really make the business model work, even if they're relatively niche areas, because then it kind of grows from there.
So, on that note, where do you see the biochar industry in the next 5 to 10 years?
So that's one is those kind of niche spaces. And I think a lot of those will grow regardless of, in some ways, whether you can sell the biochar as a high value product. Right. So biosolids to biochar, that's going to thrive. And I think that is starting to thrive. So that's one, is areas where you can get paid to take waste. Those are going to be persistent producers of biochar. The other thing that I imagine happening is that if organizations like USBI, honestly, if we can do our job well, if we can go develop out demand for physical biochar, it seems likely to me that the biggest producers in the future are going to be the companies that have access to the feedstock today, or will have it, will have access in the future. And you know, by that, I'm mostly speaking about large agricultural processing facilities and large wood processing facilities. Right. So the big timber companies and the big sort of wood manufacturers are the ones that have access to the cheapest feedstock. They have the most experience with managing feedstock and managing products like biochar. If there's a thriving market for the physical product, those companies, I think, will very likely become some of the biggest producers in the industry. And I think that means that a lot of biochar companies will probably be the companies that are the products companies, sort of the intermediaries, right? That the biochar industry becomes more of a products industry, and the producers of the material tend to become the large ag and wood processors. So that's kind of one thing that I expect to see happen. I'm also pretty hopeful that some of the fuel products will become improved, and biochar could potentially become a byproduct of other processes, particularly marine shipping fuel and sustainable aviation fuel. So SAF, some of the pathways to producing SAF are via gasification, and that produces biochar as a byproduct. Those systems are optimized for fuel production, not for biochar production, but they still produce a decent amount of biochar byproduct. So in that case, if we were to see a large bio-SAF industry in the United States or Canada, we would expect to see potentially a huge amount of residual sort of biochar as a byproduct. So that is another piece where I think there could be a significant change in the industry if that sort of sustainable aviation fuel and marine shipping fuel industry really thrives.
So we are kind of keying back or tying up on collaboration, which obviously is very important, United States and Canada and worldwide. What partnerships, whether researchers, policymakers, or industry leaders, do you think will have the biggest impact on driving biochar forward?
I think one of the things that I always try and focus on. So I've now worked in biochar in academia, in consulting, in industry, and now in the nonprofit sector. The only place I haven't worked in biochar has been in government. And one of the things that I see really missing in biochar, but also in almost any sort of industry, is better collaboration across that whole chain, from end user industries to the biochar industry to researchers. And just sort of two kind of anecdotes here. Sometimes you see a lot of research done by universities that, I'll just give an example. In the agricultural world, anytime you do really high quality research, you need to have something called a grower standard. A grower standard treatment is the grower standard. It's what the grower typically would do if it weren't for some change in practice, right? And the grower standard in every type of agriculture includes fertilizer. It is shocking to me to find so many research papers that honestly will do biochar research without a grower standard. So they'll compare biochar to soil that hasn't been fertilized. It's just an example, and it's not to pick on researchers. There's gaps on industrially led research too. I think one of the key pieces here is to make sure that the R&D demonstration projects and market development really involve that whole chain, from researchers to the biochar industry to end users, to make sure that the research that's done is done well, but also the research that's done really has relevance. And if it's successful, it has the fastest pathway to market. By including private industry and producers and end users in that research with academics, when it's successful, the ideal situation is that launches immediately into sales.
Biochar plays a crucial role in carbon sequestration. How do you see its position evolving in the broader carbon removal landscape, especially as the carbon markets start growing?
Yeah, it's a great question. And just for anybody who's not aware, thus far in the space of durable carbon removal, biochar has represented the vast majority of delivered CDR credits, something like 80 or 90%. I expect that to continue probably for at least about a decade, primarily for a few reasons. First off, biochar has a high technological readiness. Biochar can be produced today at scale. So that's one. But also the fact that there's multiple revenue streams for biochar producers means that the CDR credit doesn't have to bear the entire weight of the process of producing biochar. So it's why, when you look at durable CDR credits, biochar is typically the most affordable. And I think one of the things that's happened in this space is that the direct air capture companies and others, but largely led by direct air capture sort of advocacy, has done a very good job of convincing myself and many other corporations and many other professionals that it's really important to use durable carbon removal to offset CO2 emissions. What the DAC industry hasn't done a great job of to date is delivering a CDR credit that is remotely affordable, right? So most companies just are not going to pay $400, $500, $600 a ton. And so in some ways, I kind of see it as actually the DAC industry has largely kind of driven some of this demand to biochar as the least cost durable CDR removal technology. And again, I think that'll continue at least for about a decade or so. One of the biggest limitations of biochar is feedstock and scale. So biochar is a scalable technology, but it's scalable in the same way that most other resource-based technologies are scalable, which is that there's going to be sort of small processing, small, medium, some large, but small, medium, and some large facilities distributed around, the country and the world where there are biomass sources. But at the end of the day, there's not enough biomass out there that you can turn into biochar on an annual basis to achieve all of the carbon dioxide removal we're going to need as a globe. So I think longer term, biochar will remain probably the least cost CDR technology, but it'll maybe represent something like 10% of the long-term sort of 2050 and beyond mix of CDR. And it very likely will be one of the least cost and potentially most profitable CDR technologies out there. I expect in the long term, biochar could become a price taker, and the price maker in that market would likely be something like direct air capture.
And there's companies, I know Offstream is a company, they're out of Colorado. They do, they're quite good with that aspect as well. But yeah, it does. I have noticed that there are some places where it's very expensive to even try and get the carbon removal credits. So yeah, a lot of people probably are starting to skip that, which hopefully going forward, that aspect improves.
Yeah, and even in the short term, like I actually think that in some ways biochar is providing something of a service to a lot of other CDR technologies right now, because we do want companies to offset their emissions with durable CDR, but there has to be something that's affordable. And biochar is that affordable option right now, because if there's no affordable durable CDR, no company is going to buy it. It's just not going to happen, right? You're not going to create an industry around $400. So I think actually in some ways, I think biochar can sort of help be that bridge to a future world where there are more affordable other technologies as well.
Myles, this has been very informative, interesting conversation. I think it's, I started this whole thing to spread the word on something, like you said, so many people don't know what this is. I'm even explaining it to my friends, and I think the more people that I meet and get involved in this whole world and sort of spread it on this, I just think there's so much more potential for what you were saying to growing forward with this within, like, not even just North America, like worldwide, which is amazing. I wanted to thank you so much for joining all the way from Portland, Oregon. So for anyone that's sort of looking to, more research on what you're doing and such, where is the best place for people to, we'll post it online, but just what is website the best thing, or?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple spots you can find us. You can find our website at biochar.org. You can also find information about our conference in Minneapolis, September 15th to 18th at biocharconference.com. And then we have a very active presence on Facebook and LinkedIn. So those are probably some of the best ways to get a hold of us.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for our listeners. And one way for you to show support for the show is by subscribing on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Don't forget to rate and review, because 5-star reviews go a long way. It really helps others find the show and share this episode. A big thank you to all our listeners and Myles, of course. We'll see you next time on the Biochar Show.